Hi, Eric.
Well, hello.
I thought a good way to approach your recording experiences and techniques would be to talk about how they've changed over time. Maybe if we start with the drums, if you think about kind of the first few albums you were doing, like maybe the first Smash Mouth albums compared to now, have your drum techniques stayed the same? If they changed, maybe you could talk about that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I had a very specific drum setup that I used consistently. That I sort of developed in my early experiences recording, and it was sort of yeah. I mean, it was very similar to what the standard approach is. There was a couple of unique things that snuck in there, but um, on like the first Third Eye Blind record, that was a really good example of that drum recording approach. So um, I would use a stereo pair of overheads. That's a very common approach. My preference was C12s, and a lot of times I would rent C12s from a little audio company in Northern California. So that first Third Eye Blind record, it's a pair of C12s over the drums. There were moments when there's a couple songs in the record where I wanted something that was just a little moodier and more sort of nostalgic sounding, so I'd use Cole's 4038s as overheads instead of the C12s. And then the snare drum, I would always have a 57 on there, and then I would put something else on there just to kind of blend with it. So I ended up doing a U67 was on the snare drum, and there was also a bottom snare mic. So there's like three mics on the snare. I really like C12As on toms, and so I'd always try and use those for all the toms. And the floor toms, I would mic the bottoms as well. So I'd mic the top with a C12A, and then try and put maybe a 47 FET or some other sort of good low endy large diaphragm condenser mic on the bottom. And the kick drum was at that time was always a combination of a 47 FET and this Audio-Technica ATM 25, a dynamic mic, and I would blend those two together to get the kick drum sound. There was always like a cool phasing thing that would happen that would help scoop out some of those low mids that make the kick drum sound kind of puffy. And then for room mics, I did a few different things. There were times it depended on the room that I was in. Sometimes if it was a smaller room, I would actually use a dynamic microphone that had a very tight cardioid pattern and have it pointed away from the drums. So I'm getting all diffused room sound, and would help make the room sound a little bigger. Maybe even put them on the other side of a gobo, pointed away from the drums, just to try and make the room sound as big as possible.
Do you have any problems with noise on the preamps doing that?
Not usually. I mean, all of this stuff, this was all loud rock band stuff, so it was always plenty loud. Some of the stuff that I've been recording more recently, it would be hard to get away with that, because people are just playing way, way softer. But no, there was always plenty of volume to grab in the room with that stuff. And then there was, the Third Eye Blind record. We recorded some of it in my studio at the time, HOS recording, which was a much larger room. And in there, I had a pair of AKG 460s that I really liked for room mics. They were just super flat, really, really accurate. It just sounded exactly like what it sounded like when you were standing in the room. Those were great. 87s were really great. So a lot of times it was, one of those two as pairs in the room. And we recorded at Skywalker Ranch for some of it, which has an enormous sound room. One of the biggest sound rooms I've ever been in. It was really designed for scoring films. And they had an amazing mic collection. So they had Neumann M50s, and I set up an M50 Decatree to capture the room sound for the drums when we were there. It was a really cool sound. So you can hear that like on the song God of Wine. It's really featured on that song. Or Good For You, you can really hear it on that. And the sound of my room is more the Semi-Charmed Life. There was another smaller studio that we recorded at, which was the studio called Toast in San Francisco, and that was the song Graduate. That was the like smaller room with a dynamic mic. They were actually Sennheiser 441s on the room. And the other thing that I would always do is have a mono room mic that I use for the kick drum. And so I would control the gating of it with one of the close mics that was on the kick drum, so I could really have the gate only open up when the kick drum hits, and use that for this just like punchy, real chesty room sound on the kick drum to just make the kick drum not sound like just a click with some low end attached to it, but actually sound like a kick drum in the room, you know. And so that was really kind of my thing, you know, for the first round of Smash Mouth recordings and that Third Eye Blind record. And then there was a cool thing that I heard about while I was working on that record. I heard about it third hand. So there's a really amazing engineer, this guy Jakir King. He was actually the assistant that came with the studio Toast. He was, you know, just terribly overqualified to be an assistant, even back then. And so he assisted me when I was recording the Third Eye Blind stuff at Toast. And he told me about a thing that he had heard about, which was putting a U87 on the batter side of the kick drum underneath the snare drum, and you put it in cardioid facing the drum head of the batter side of the kick drum, and it picks up the bottom of the snare, and you get this really cool knocky attack of the kick drum. And I heard about it. I ended up not really trying it until later. I tried it when I got into actually recording the rest of the first Smash Mouth record in '97, and I totally fell in love with it and used it, you know, religiously from that point forward. He heard about it from a guy named David Bianco, another amazing engineer. And so I just loved it. We just add this amazing detail to both the kick and the snare drum in a very isolated way. And it was cool. It was almost had this kind of trashy quality to it that I really liked. It was just great. And so that's all over the first Smash Mouth record and pretty much everything I did for a few years after that. So,
did you ever have any problems with cymbal bleed into that mic? Because I've tried a few kind of similar things with kind of mic trying to pick up the whole underside of the kit and the click of the drum, but the cymbal bleed was so kind of bad it just didn't work out.
That's interesting. That was never an issue with that mic. So, I mean, where I'm putting it, it's you know how like if you're a right-handed drummer, you have the kick drum sitting there, and then you have your right foot on the kick drum. The snare drum is between your legs, and so the snare drum is sort of on the left side of the kick drum, and so the mic sits right under the snare drum, facing at the batter head, and the bottom.
Oh, I see. So okay.
Yeah, and so like uses the snare drum as a baffle, and so I never really had significant problems with cymbal bleed in that position. You get a lot. And the mic is, like 2 or 3 inches from the batter head of the kick drum. I mean, you just get an insane amount of kick drum and snare drum, And so, so that hadn't been an issue for me in that position. And that sort of evolved over the years. There was a time when I stopped putting it under the snare and I wanted to get more of just the attack of the kick drum. And I started using a little Sony lapel mic that I would actually tape to the top side of the rim of the kick drum and just let it dangle down and look down across the batter head of the kick drum, maybe just like 6 inches above where the kick drum beater would hit the head, And so I used that on, I I was doing that probably on the first Good Charlotte record. I was definitely doing it on the Lost Prophets record. The Lost Prophets record was one of the first ones where I used the underheads thing, where I got the drummer to put the cymbals up higher and had mics in figure eight that were getting the toms and the cymbals. And so the microphone would go in, below the cymbal, but above the toms. And so that was a thing I was into for a few years. I did that on the Lost Prophets record. I think I did it on a Taking Back Sunday record.
Was that normally like a U87 or something like that?
I did it with C12s or C12As or the Coles 4038s. And the 4038s are tricky. Like if you play too hard, you can't get them too close to the toms, But it was cool, it gave just a very natural and very isolated, stereo picture of the drum kit, because of the nature of the figure eight pattern. Like the mic that was on the left side of the kit that was getting the crash cymbal over there and the hi-hat and the rack tom, like you would get entirely just those elements because the node of the pattern is looking across the drum kit, and you get none of the floor tom and none of the ride cymbal or the crash cymbal that's on the other side of the kit. So it was pretty good for getting a very wide, very isolated stereo image. So that was cool for a while. And then after that, I started getting into a more minimalistic thing. I was having these sessions where I had like fucking 15, 16 tracks of drum mics, and it just got ridiculous. I was just, I don't want to spend my time having to mix all of these tracks and having to set all these goddamn mics up. This is just too much, And so I started stripping things back more and more and more until, more recently I've been doing a lot of stuff with just one microphone for the drums. And I'm a lot happier with that approach. It takes a little bit of trickery with the mixing to make sure that you can really get the low end impact and stuff. But the mixing tricks that I need to do in order to make one mic work is way less time and way less complicated than the pain in the ass of having to deal with the phasing of having 16 different microphones on one sound source. It's a mess. It's just a mess. So
yeah. Were you doing a lot of kind of Glenn Johns as well with the minimal techniques?
I did, yeah. I did some of the over under stuff on let's see, on the Slash record. The first Slash record that I recorded is like the over under thing. And I had a slight variation of it. His original thing where the under mic is looking across the floor tom at the snare drum. I found that the way the phasing lines up with that was a little too disconnected for me. And so I ended up taking that mic and pulling it up a little higher and facing it down more and being careful to have it be equidistant to the snare drum. And so I kind of, just cheated that spot up and angled a little bit just to make the phasing add up in a more focused way. So it's not too totally isolated sounds. And it worked well on the Slash record. There's,
yeah.
How
are you normally panning the overheads in Glenn Johns or over under?
With that, I wouldn't do it quite as much, just hard panning left and right because, the snare drum is not in the center of those two mics. It's, the over mic is way more snare heavy. And so a lot of times I'd actually have to take the close mic on the snare and lean that a little bit to the right just to try and get the snare drum to sort of arrive more in a, balanced middle way, and sometimes I would just bring in the left and the right a little bit if it got too wide sounding, because you can lose a little bit of the punch and the focus if it's splayed out too wide.
With the more minimal techniques, is it normally like FET 47 on the kick and 57 on the snare, or?
There's actually no close mics on the drums at all. Yeah, none. So this whole last record that I was working on, it's just one microphone, and my favorite spot is it's a little bit out in front of the kit, and if it's a 4-piece drum set, so you just have one rack tom, one floor tom, and there's like a hi-hat and a cymbal on the left side and a crash cymbal and a ride cymbal on the right side. I try and put the mic sort of equidistant between the rack tom and the floor tom, looking in towards the snare drum. And that has gotten me the most balanced picture of the kit with one mic. You can't get away with putting the ride cymbal right in that traditional spot where it's sitting over the floor tom. I have to move that off to the right, so it's to the right of the floor tom, or you just get all ride cymbal. But man, I love it. It sounds like drums. It just sounds like real drums, like nobody listens to a drum set with their ear 1 inch from the fucking snare drum. And so, nobody really knows what that, what that actually sounds like until you hear it come out of the speakers. And it doesn't sound like a drum set in a room at all. It's a real problem. And so, so I just love having this mic, and, you can make it a little closer, a little farther if you want more or less room, how intimate you want it to sound. And then when I'm mixing, I make a duplicate of that one track, and I gate it so the duplicate only opens when the kick drum hits, and then I'll filter it very, very extremely, so a low pass filter way down at like 50 hertz, and use that as the low end for the kick drum. And so you get plenty of punchy attack and detail out of the one mic, that's the full bandwidth, and then you just blend in this filtered subby low end to have a more modern low end to it.
Is that with a Beyer M160? I think that's what I've seen you do it with before.
Yes, yeah, the 160 is amazing for that. I've done it with an RCA 77 is great. It works with more hi-fi stuff. I did it with a 251 one time. But yeah, mostly ribbon mics. I did one where it was in that position. I had 2 Coles microphones. So one where it's facing the drums, and then the other one, so it's like an MS pair. The other one that is turned, exactly 90 degrees from the one that's facing the drums. And then you can do, an MS recording of the drums, which is kind of cool because you can just blend in however much of a stereo image you want. You can have it just be mono, or you can widen it out a little bit. And so that's worked really well also.
What kind of compression do you normally find yourself doing if it's just one mic? My favorites are still an 1176. I have a blackface 1176 that's amazing, just great, aggressive, very thick sounding compression. The Unfair Child is incredible. That ends up doing it a lot of times. This last record, I'm using a lot less compression, so I'm not compressing the drums at all. And there's just a little bit of compression on the overall mix, either with an Unfair Child or this old Altec tube limiter. I've actually really been enjoying that. I am by nature sort of a contrarian, and as modern records are getting more and more compressed, I want to go in the opposite direction and have these records that are just really just open and huge sounding,
it's pretty wonderful when you get it in your car and turn it up, and there's just all this space and dynamics. It feels incredible.
With those minimal mic techniques, do you find the room plays a really big kind of part in how they end up sounding?
It does, yeah. I mean, you have a lot less control over how you can manipulate things. And I had an interesting thing where I recently moved to a new area of Southern California. I'm in this area called Topanga Canyon, and I built a small home studio here that I was really intending for it to be a mix room. And I did a bunch of acoustic treatment to the room and all that, and then I was starting to work on demos for the album. I literally just finished minutes ago. Finally, just finished the mastering of it, and started recording some drums in this room, and it was insane. Like, this room is so musical sounding. I can put a microphone anywhere in this room, and it sounds incredible. And other rooms are definitely not like that. And I took the same drum set, the same microphones, the same preamps in a different room when we were re-recording this stuff, and didn't have anywhere near the same like punch and focus, and just like this warm, like the sound is focused in the fundamental punch of the drum kit instead of being this kind of thin, splashy, brittle sounding thing. So the room is a big part of it for sure.
So maybe going back to comparing how you used to do things now, maybe we can move on to electric guitar. Was there kind of a go-to back then and compared to now?
Sure, yeah. Back in the Third Eye Blind era, I had 3 microphones that were my go-tos for guitar. There was a 57, there was a Beyer M201, it was basically their version of a 57, the Sennheiser 441, and occasionally I'd use a condenser mic, like a U87 or something like that. And I would usually just put all 4, like if it was a 412 cabinet, put a mic on every speaker, and then just see which ones sound the best, try combinations, and just sort of play with combinations or, blending them or whatever until I got something that felt right. And so that was like all of that, Third Eye Blind and Smash Mouth stuff early on. And, again, it was just sort of a complicated, slow way to do it. And in some ways, I was missing the opportunity to really capture how an amp sounds in the space that it's in. And so now I'm very rarely putting microphones right in front of the speaker. Yeah, the microphones are usually 3, 4, 5, 6 feet away from the amp. And it's amazing, like, it still is a very focused sound, but I find that it just has so much more personality to it. It's a very identifiable sound, that has its own character and its own life to it, instead of just being this sort of very microscopic, surgical sounding thing.
What kind of mics are you normally using that far back?
All kinds of stuff. I like both ribbons and condensers in this context. So it could be, a Coles or a 77 or an RCA 44 if I'm going for something darker and deeper sounding. The Sony C37 can be really incredible when it's off the amp a little bit. That was a mic that Jimi Hendrix used a lot for his guitar. I love U87, 67, the 251, all of those sound amazing just in the room, capturing the whole sound of the amp, And it's really fun. You can just take the mic and I don't put a whole lot of thought into it now. I just grab the mic and just sort of plop it someplace in the room, see what it sounds like, And if it's cool, great. I got my sound, I'm moving on. If it's lacking lows or highs, or doesn't seem to be coming across right, or it's got a weird phasey, notch in it or something, I just grab it and throw it somewhere else in the room, and don't overthink it, and just use my ears. And when something cool pops out of the speakers, great, here we go. And I find that I'm capturing more unique sounds with that approach, instead of trying to figure it out on a calculator first. I think you can waste a lot of time doing that.
Do you ever kind of miss low end just doing things that far back?
Yeah, sometimes it can get a little thin, but there's an easy remedy. Just don't put it right in front of the amp. When you get it off access, you can literally EQ the sound with the position of the mic. If you want it brighter, put it more in front of the speaker. If you want it boomier and bassier, then just pull it off away from the direct line of the speaker, and it warms right up.
So maybe moving on to like electric bass back then compared to now.
Yeah, so back then, all of these have sort of followed the same trend. I was in the habit of using multiple amps and a DI and all of this stuff. So typically there was at least, a DI signal, an SVT, and I always liked miking the SVT a little further back. Even back then, I was already, having that experience with that particular speaker cabinet. I never liked the way that thing sounded with a mic, 1 inch away from one of the 8 speakers. And so I used to put the mic about 30 inches back, and right in the center, the focal point between either the 4 upper or 4 lower speakers. The 4 lower were a little subbier, the 4 upper were a little punchier and more detailed sounding. And you get a much clearer, more aggressive mid-range when you do that, rather than put the mic, 1 inch from one of the 8 speakers. So I do that, and then usually some little like guitar combo amp that'll get like a more distorted, grindy mid-range go, and blend that in for a really cool pick attack, or just some sort of character in the mid-range that I can turn up. So the SVT doesn't have to be so blown out, and I have another amp that's a little more distorted that gives me that grittiness that I can blend in. And then the DI typically I would use for the sub part, And I always used to have to play with, back then I was recording on tape machines with consoles and all that. And I used to use a TC Electronics 2290 digital delay. It was sort of like the most high resolution digital delay on the market, for lining up the timing of the DI signal with the bass amp. Because, I had the microphone a couple feet away from the speaker cabinet. That's a couple milliseconds of delay. And so I would take the DI signal and delay it with the 2290. You could also get tenths of a second, tenths of a millisecond with that device, and line up, the DI with the amp signals, and so now, I've done a few different things. There was a period where I got really into just using the bass DI, and it's sort of like the old Motown approach, where it was a DI, but they ran it through an Ampex preamp with a bunch of gain, so it would break up a little there, and then go to a tape machine, and you get a little more coloration from the tape machine, and give you this really fat, warm sound. With just a DI, that was.
Have you tried the new Motown DI, the Acme Audio one?
Yeah. And so, I got into doing that for a bunch of stuff. And then, on this last project, we had kind of a unique thing. We wanted to a very distinct bass sound for the record. And so we ended up using a Fender Bass 6. And I would use just one amp in kind of a small room. It's like a large booth, but I stereo mic'd the amp. And so it was just a more ambient bass sound that just kind of wraps around, the listener more than this like really mono focused thing. And I'd even take one of the mics and delay it maybe, 13, 14 milliseconds just to have even widen it out more. And so yeah, I mean, I think it's more recently it's been more about like capturing an instrument that has a specific personality, a memorable quality to it that jumps out, rather than just getting the technical job done of getting a very nice clear low end and all that,
Okay, so maybe moving on to acoustic guitar. I know you've been a fan of mid-side and certain stereo techniques. Maybe you could talk about that.
Sure, yeah. There's been a couple of things over the years. So, yeah, early on, I was really into the mid-side thing. I had this this Bronner stereo tube microphone that was pretty amazing for acoustic guitar, and so I would set that thing up in a mid-side configuration. I used that on all of the early Smash Mouth stuff. Probably, I would guess, on the Third Eye Blind stuff as well. And then there was a point where, when I was working on the Nickel Creek record, which obviously really features acoustic guitars and acoustic instruments in general, I wanted to get just a bigger, wider acoustic guitar sound on the songs where the acoustic guitar was sort of the centerpiece, and then there was like a mandolin and a violin sort of hovering around on each side. And so I started doing this thing where I'd take two condenser mics and it was these Sheps 221s. They're just amazing on acoustic guitar, and just take one and angle it 45 degrees down towards the lowest E string, and then have one below the guitar, below the sound hole, angling up 45 degrees at the high E string. And so you almost get like this grand piano effect where the low and high strings sort of pan across the speakers. And it's just an amazingly huge, really focused sound. And in some ways I think was more natural. It caught a more natural picture than the MS version that I was doing before. MS stuff, there's always this risk of having one side be deficient in low end, and this was much more balanced with the low end. And so I was doing that for a long time, whenever it was like an individual featured acoustic guitar, that was sort of the centerpiece of the recording. That 221, there was, and I think it was both mics. There was a song on the All American Rejects record that I recorded, where those mics worked so well on the guitar that he had that from recording to all the way through mastering, they were never EQ'd. So there was a little bit of compression, on them at one point, but I didn't EQ them when I tracked them. I didn't EQ them when I mixed them, and there was no EQing done in the mastering of the song. And so it was sort of like the perfect guitar recording, at least for that song.
Do you have any tips for recording acoustic guitar at the same time as a singer? Obviously, singer playing the acoustic.
Oh, right. Yeah, that is tricky. For that, I put the microphone that is being sung into in figure eight. And so, you can angle it so the node of the pattern is pointed right at the sound hole of the guitar, and it cancels out all of that low end from the acoustic guitar, and you really get a much more focused, recording of the vocals. You'll get ambience of the guitar and the vocal mic as it sort of, pours out into the recording space and gets into the backside of the pattern. But, that's actually, I think, is a good thing. It adds a little space, and air to the guitar sound. And then on the guitar itself, I always like putting the microphone not directly in front of the sound hole. I find that's a really boomy, unbalanced place to put the microphone. So I put it a little further down the neck, usually around the 15th fret. Maybe just a foot, 12, maybe 18 inches away, right around there. And, you can do a similar trick with that mic. If you use Fig 8 and angle it the right way, it'll cancel out the singer's voice. Just aim the node of the pattern, which would be like the top of a 251. You just aim that right at the singer's mouth, and you get very, very little vocal in that mic. So those patterns work really, really well for that. I did quite a bit of that with Nickel Creek, where I would put them in a semicircle where, a mic placed directly in front of the mandolin player put the node of that microphone pointing directly at the acoustic guitar player who was sitting next to him, and then the same thing with the violin player. And, you use the pattern to naturally cancel out the adjacent player.
Maybe moving on to piano, kind of ground or upright, any techniques over the years?
Sure, yeah. For grand piano, I tend to, I don't like sticking the mics way up inside just over the harp. I find that the sound is really phasey and weird, and I get lots of mid-range anomalies inside, underneath the lid of the piano. I've seen some people really put them like right over where the hammers hit the strings and stuff, and that always just sounds really weird to me, too claustrophobic. And so I like to pull them out more of the piano and have the mics a little closer to each other and create a little XY thing. So one is kind of angled off looking at the low strings, and the other one is angled off looking more at the high strings, both in cardioid. And that's always just sounded more natural. It just sounds like the piano in the room. I do like getting even those mics can end up sounding pretty phasey, and so I find that room mics help sort of smooth that out. So I'll put mics in the room just totally faced away from the piano, and use that to just create a sort of glue and air to sort of glue the whole sound of the piano together. I did a recording on this last record where I had a piano player and a singer in the room at the same time. I wanted to just capture the sound of the whole thing just happening in the room together all at once. And so there was a pair of mics on the piano and, a pair of mics in the room, and then a mic that the singer was singing into, and just positioned the singer so I'd get the right amount of vocal in the room mics and the piano and everything, and just be able to try and balance it all out. And it's really cool. Just it feels like you're just in the room with them,
Maybe with upright, are you generally miking from the front, kind of front of the hammers, or from behind, or?
Yeah, it's sort of, for obvious reasons, it kind of depends what you're going for. The piano that I have sounds really, really cool, both when you put the mics on the front, just right over the harp, where the hammers hit the strings, but it's a really aggressive, very attacky sound. This particular upright is really old. It's probably about 100 years old, and all the felts have hardened to the point where it almost sounds like a tack piano. And so if you really want that super, aggressive attack, it's really great for that. And then the backside of it is really cool. There's no opening there at all, but just the sound somehow finding its way out through the back of the enclosure is a very cool, diffused, kind of warmer, deeper sound off of this particular piano, and I've used that quite a bit as well.
Do you have any kind of go-to mics for those situations?
Yeah, I love Cole's 4038s on a piano. I love those. That's probably what I use the most. On this particular piano, condenser mics get way too bright on the front side. It's just too clanky, too clacky. And I'm trying to think if I've used anything else on the backside. So really the 438s have been the thing for that.
So maybe moving on to vocals now. Obviously it varies a lot with the singer, but do you have any sort of techniques or particular mics that you've gone to over the years?
Yeah, I mean, probably the mainstays have been an Elam 251, so that was the mic for the vocals on the first Third Eye Blind record, and the SM7. The SM7 has a thing, like it just sounds so in your face. It's really, really cool. I've used that mic so much on so many records. And it takes EQ really well for some reason. Like you can just really wrench on it with EQ and kind of push it wherever you need it to go, and it seems to take the EQ better than other mics. So those have always been, a couple of my favorites. They've probably gotten the most use over the years. I do like ribbon mics for vocals as well. I know on the first Smash Mouth record, I wanted to get a more vintage vocal sound for Walking on the Sun, and so we used a Cole's 4038, the vocals on that particular song. The rest of the album was definitely SM7. More recently, I have an RCA 77 that I love. You got to EQ the crap out of it because it's so dark sounding, but the high end that you get when you turn it up is just beautiful sounding. It's really incredible. And so I've used that on quite a bit of stuff. 44 is amazing for vocals. Again, it needs tons of EQ. I'll either use like an Undertone audio EQ when I'm tracking, or I have these old Siemens W295 equalizers, and those are pretty incredible. Like the high frequency knob on there on an RCA 77, you can just turn it all the way up and it just sounds beautiful.
With the SM7, what's your go-to preamp? Because I found it makes a huge difference, especially with that mic.
Yeah, I mean, for a long time I was always using Neves. I had a rack of 1064s. That was just the preamp that I had used early on in my career, and I just knew it, and so I stuck with it for a long time. And then, when we switched to when we developed the Undertone audio circuitry and made a mic preamp ourselves, that was one of the things that I checked. I made sure that it would sound good with an SM7. And so that's the preamp that I use for pretty much everything at this point. But yeah, early on it was just a Neve, 1073 style mic preamp.
So maybe moving on to talk about compression and processing in general. How do you decide whether to compress kind of on the individual tracks or on like the drum bus or any other bus and the two bus at the end?
Yeah, I mean it's very genre specific. I think I went through my big sort of compression fetish earlier in my career, where it was just an experiment to see how much I could compress things, and so some of those early records have unbelievable amounts of compression on them, and there is sort of a game that you play, where I think for me, you know, I would compress, you know, the individual kick and snare mics of the drum kit, and then not really compress the overheads individually, and those would get caught in a drum submix, you know, that has compression. And I mean, it was just an insane amount, you know. I was using just distressors on everything, and so the kick and the snare would have, you know, 10, 12, 14 dB of compression, and then the whole drum mix would also have, you know, be metering 10, 12, 14 dB of compression, you know. And then the mix would have compression, probably less than that, more like, you know, 3 or 4 dB of compression on it. And so, you know, it was just a different kind of thing. And now, this last record I'm just finishing, there's no compression on any, you know, individual drum, anything. And so it just gets compressed in the overall mix bus. And I'm actually paralleling the mix bus compression. So certain instruments that need to sort of stand out in the mix go to an uncompressed bus that's in parallel. And so that overall bus compression is mostly to just, you know, anchor the drums and the bass, and they'll catch a little bit of the guitars and keyboards and other stuff.
Do you have a kind of standard 2-bus? I mean, I'm sure the Unfair Child, but anything else that's normally in it?
Yeah, you know, I love the Unfair Child. That's probably on there the most. I have these modified Altec 436Cs that I really like as well. They're very similar to the Fairchilds, the Unfair Childs. I have an API 2500, and sometimes I'll use that in combination with one of the tube compressors in series. And so I'll set each of them a little lighter, and, you know, the tube compressor adds more sort of girth and color to the sound and does a little bit of compression, and then the 2500 has more of this like brick wall where it just holds things in place better. And so the combination of the two can be really, really great. And so, you know, the trend is definitely has been to simplify things. And it's interesting when I listen to these final mixes, they don't sound like they're not compressed. But I think there's a point when there's layers and layers and layers of compression that you really stop getting the benefit of each of those layers of compression. And I think you really can just kind of do one round of it. When it's set carefully and it's a good sounding compressor, you can just kind of catch it all in one shot at the end, you know.
Are you typically doing any EQ on the 2-bus?
I am, yeah. I used to not do that. I used to feel like it was cheating, or I'd somehow failed at mixing if I was EQing the 2-bus, and I've gotten over that. And so now, like, the mastering of records has such a tremendous impact on the dynamics and the sound of the record that I have to incorporate a mastering chain into my mixing process, just to make sure that everything is going to work together. Like, if I get the mix sounding perfect the way I want it before all that limiting goes on there's no way it's going to sound the same. Like, it absolutely has to change once all of that dynamic processing happens in the mastering. And so I just add it while I'm mixing and mix to accommodate it. And it's actually an interesting, conundrum right now, because things are changing. I was just sort of digging around in the internet trying to figure out what the state of the loudness war is at right now, and it's starting to back away, because the source that everybody's using for listening now is mostly streaming, and all the streaming services are using level normalizing algorithms. And so even if you deliver to them the loudest fucking master you've ever heard in your life, their algorithm analyzes the file and just turns it down. And so I'm actually right now trying to figure out what I'm going to do about that. Because I still want to have a healthy volume for the CD version that's released. That's at least in the same ballpark as other stuff out there. And then I think I'm going to do a totally different master that's delivered to the streaming services. So they don't just level my mixes down,
I think there's a website where you can upload a track and it tells you how much each streaming service will turn down your mix.
Yeah, it's I actually did that this morning.
Right.
It's the loudness penalty analyzer.
Yeah, that was one. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm actually going to take that to heart. This is going to be an experiment because this is all new since the last time that I've mastered a record, and so I'm very curious to see how this is going to play out. So there's probably going to be a version of these masters that has a good 5 or 6 dB less limiting on them, which is also kind of interesting because I was monitoring with all that limiting while I was mixing, and so the mixes may actually not sound quite right without it, and so I'm trying to figure out what the hell to do about it. So we'll see how that plays out. But one of the things that I've been doing is I've been using the universal audio version of the EQ-P1A, the Pultec EQ, using that on the mix bus to shape the low end. And man, it is pretty magical when you set it way low, like at 20 or 30 hertz, and you do a boost and a cut at the same time. It does this unbelievable thing where it just moves all of the low end energy to this, more sub region, and it just adds incredible depth to the mix. I've been really enjoying that a lot. So,
yeah, I'll definitely try that.
I highly recommend it. Just set the boost and the attenuate, right around 4 or 5, and you'll hear this amazing, deep low end just emerge on your mix. It's really cool. And so I have it on there while I'm mixing. And the other thing I've been doing lately is using multiband compression for just the low frequencies. So kind of where I'm ending up with things now is I still enjoy compression more for the low frequencies than the high frequencies. Things just tend to start sounding kind of harsh and messy and, small and too crowded, and you lose a lot of detail and definition when you get too much compression going in the mid-range and high frequencies. And so, so I do more compression in the low end and leave the high end just kind of uncompressed and leave all the dynamics up there. And it, you have this really solid foundation that holds up the mix, and then this wonderfully sort of open and natural dynamic sound in the mids and high frequencies.
What's your standard multiband compressor?
I've been using Wave C4, as part of my mastering chain. Again, I have that active while I'm mixing because it has a pretty significant effect to the low end of the mix. So I have to be listening to it while I'm mixing it.
So you're mastering this album yourself completely?
I am, yeah. I think I've been doing that more and more recently, just because, like I mentioned, the mastering has such a huge effect on the sound of the mixes that depending on what the mastering chain is doing, it would cause me to do things differently while I'm mixing. And so I'm just trying to like get it all to work together, and I'm really happy with it on this round of stuff. It just sounds really big and just very comfortable to listen to. I'm kind of tired of listening to stuff that feels like it's just being strangled. It's very, very fatiguing to listen to, and so I want to have stuff come on and just have it just feel comfortable, just feel natural, and not a strain on my ears, and so I feel like I've gotten a lot closer to that. This morning I ended up pulling off one of the stages of loudness limiting on this thing. I'm going to go just a little bit quieter, maybe by about a dB, maybe dB and a half on this record. And, it feels great. It feels great. It sounds like music. It sounds like, all the records that I've loved listening to growing up,
What limiter are you normally using then for the kind of mastering stage?
I love the FabFilter Pro L2. So I've been using that for all my mastering stuff. That's sort of my final stage for getting the level. I've found that thing to just be the most invisible, the most musical sounding, all the limiters. It's a really impressive tool.
So maybe moving on to talk about kind of reverb and delays and that sort of thing. Especially I was thinking about Songs for the Deaf. It's such kind of upfront record, but there's still a lot of kind of depth and space around it, even though it's not super audible. Maybe you could talk about your approach to that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, that record, it was very intentional. We wanted to make a record that was super, super in your face, but still have it live in an identifiable environment. And so, we put the drums in a drum booth, but there were room mics, and there really weren't close mics on the drums. I mean, I had them there just as sort of a safety net, but the drum sound is mostly these 3 drum kit microphones. There's 3 overheads. There's a left, center, and right above the drum kit, and it was capturing, the toms, the snare, and the overall sound of the kit. We had more of a luxury to do that because we had made the decision to record the cymbals separately, so I could kind of put the mics wherever I wanted around the kit and optimize them to just capture this very sort of natural sound of the kit. And then there were a pair of C37As that were just way up high, towards the ceiling in the booth. It's a tall ceiling in this booth. It's about 15 feet high. And so those were capturing more of the room sound. And so you hear that like tight, boxy, sort of claustrophobic room sound on the drums. So there is a space there that you can hear the drums living in, but it's very tight and very focused. And so it was kind of the same thing, for the bass and the guitar. We just wanted everything right up in your face. And then when there were moments when we used reverb, it's very deliberate and very dramatic. It's not like this just sort of constant drone of, drippy reverb on everything. It's like there would all of a sudden be a thing that just sounds very ambient and distant and have it be very intentional and very deliberate when you're going to put something in another space, and so, on that, the reverbs were either with, a spring reverb on an amp, or, at Barefoot Recording, I have a reverb chamber, and I still find that an actual acoustic space, for some reason, is still just more identifiable as creating a sense of distance and space, more so than any of the plugins or digital reverbs have ever been able to do. So we did a lot more of that, just using acoustic spaces, real chambers, to have things be, actually really be distant when you wanted them to. There was the one song. God, I'm so bad at remembering titles. Hold on a second. Let me get my act together here. think it's called Mosquito Song. Is that right? Yeah, Mosquito Song. That one we actually recorded outside. So the acoustic guitars we were set up outside with Josh, and it was probably Alan Johannes was playing the other guitar, and so I don't know if you've ever done much recording outside, but there's no ambience at all. It's like it's super, super dry. Ended up being a really cool sound for the acoustic guitars. Let's see. God is in the Radio. The drums were actually in the big room at Barefoot Recording. At the time, the whole room was carpeted, so it was still kind of like a darker, thuddier sound, but you can hear more of a room sound on the drums on that song. Let's see. What else? Yeah, most of the rest of the stuff was all done, in that tiny little booth. Yeah.
Do you have any kind of more general tips for using kind of reverb and delay and spatial effects kind of subtly?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to gravitate towards the more organic versions of this stuff. So I love the Roland Space Echo or Chorus Echo is the version that I use, the SRE 555. So it's a combination of a tape delay and a spring reverb built into one box. I love that thing on vocals. You can come with these settings where it's like a tapped tape delay, with spring reverb on it, and it gives you just this really amazing, dark, very resonant, beautiful, long reverb for vocals that just put it in this space. And I also really like mono reverb on vocals. That it creates a focus, for the lead vocal that I think is very classic sounding. And for other stuff, I always try and get it out of natural spaces. If you have a big room, use that room. If you have a chamber, the chambers are incredible for percussion and all kinds of stuff. It just sounds. Your brain will identify it as space and ambience more clearly when it's a natural space. I have an EMT plate reverb. I use that a lot. For plugins, I like Vintage Verb. I have to say I sort of struggle with the plugin reverbs. They always sound pretty disappointing for me. Whenever I turn them on, I'm just like, why would I even want to use this? There is one. It's a spring reverb. Impulse response that's in the Avid reverb plugin called Space, and the one that I really like is, let's see, let me find it here. It's called Mic Mix Master Room. And it has 4 different impulses: dark, medium, bright, and bright. And I really like the bright one. That's probably of the reverb plugins. I probably use that the most. And right now there's definitely a trend to just put a lot of reverb on stuff. A lot of things I'm hearing coming out. I just hear tons and tons of reverb all over everything. So that's why, as you'd expect, the record I'm finishing right now has very little reverb on it. It's bone dry. And so like the vocals, I'm putting the lead vocal mic, it was a 251 on this. I'm putting it in Omni, so you can just hear the relatively small spaces that the singer is singing in. And it's just a much more intimate experience. You really feel like you're right next to the person that's singing. And I feel like, particularly for this record, which is a very personal, intimate record, that the whole thing feels a lot more sincere, and it feels like, it feels more honest and sincere, just hearing somebody in a room just really pouring their heart out. It's a very powerful experience,
Have you tried the Sound Toys play plugin?
I know it's a great plugin and lots of people love it and they use it all the time. I haven't connected with it. But what I will say is they released this kind of this plugin that sort of flew under the radar. It's their emulation. It's an EQ plugin of that Siemens W295 equalizer that I mentioned before, and I fucking love that thing. I use that thing all over the place. It is like the best mid-range and high-frequency booster I've ever found in plug-in form. In fact, I was so impressed with it. It's the first time this has ever happened where I got the plug-in and was like, whoa, this is so musical. I love this thing. I can boost, all these frequencies that normally would just tear my ears off, and they just feel so musical. And so I ended up seeking out and buying, the original hardware, vintage hardware versions of it, and just to check them out and see what it was like, and they're equally wonderful. So I do use both now when I'm mixing. I have 3 of the original hardware versions that I'll put on some stuff, and then I use that plugin all over the mixes.
Yeah, so. I love the drive on that as well. It's really useful.
Yeah.
You were saying before with the Songs for the Deaf record, it was kind of very deliberately, very upfront. Do you kind of normally have kind of aesthetics that you talk about with the band that you're going for a whole record?
Definitely. I get very nervous about starting recording a record if I don't have a really clear vision in mind of what we're all going for. If you don't have that, it's a real great way to waste a lot of time. And so, with each of the bands that I work with, I will spend a good amount of time just hanging out with them, listening to music, really getting a sense of what their sort of collective taste is. And sometimes it's interesting. There'll be things that come up that they wouldn't really even think to incorporate as an influence. It's something they truly love, but they've never really recognized it as an influence. And when you start talking to people about music and records they love and what they love about them, I'll start to find things that's like, wow, this should really be a part of the aesthetic of this band. With Good Charlotte, they were huge fans of Danny Elfman's soundtracks. That was one of the things they used to keep, soundtrack CDs in their car. So they're driving around in their car listening to the soundtrack to Edward Scissorhands, and which I just thought was so odd, and but really cool and a very unique influence for the band. And so it's like, we need to have this be a part of your world because it's a natural part of what your guys' musical, universe is. And so, we created a whole album intro that was very much inspired by the Danny Elfman, compositions and arrangements and stuff, and then incorporated those textures throughout the record. And it's something that, they would have never even considered including because I think it really didn't have anything to do with their band, but that's what makes it cool. You can take a punk pop band and add a whole new dimension to it it's going to be punk pop Edward Scissorhands, like that's a new thing that hasn't existed before. So let's do that, And so that's a really important part of the process for me is having that vision and knowing where to go with it. So,
one more. I really apologize if you get asked this regularly, but are you aware of the kind of Smash Mouth All-Star, what it's become in kind of the internet?
Sure, yeah. There's actually a lot of that going on right now because it's the 20th anniversary of the release of that song, and so. Literally before talking to you, I just finished an interview with Rolling Stone magazine because they're going to do an oral history of the song All Star. And so yeah, I'm very aware of it, and So yeah, it's a thing.
Yeah. I think that's all my questions. Thanks so much for talking to me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Great questions. We covered a lot of ground, and I hope it's, there's something helpful in there for folks.